Alright, we're in the final stretch here. This is chapter 27, part 1. Suppose a financial analyst suggests that investors should now hold cash instead of stocks or bonds. The analyst is probably encouraging an increase in money holdings for which reason? So there are 3 reasons that we would hold our money. The first one is we need money to carry out transactions, right? Just our basic everyday things. We're assuming either now that you're holding your money or it's loaned out. Those are the only 2 options, right? So whether you hold it in a bank account, in cash, whatever, that part isn't too important. So that first part, that transactions part, is called transactional demand for money. We all have some transactional demand for money. The next thing is the next reason is emergencies. We know we want to have a little bit of extra cash on hand, just because you never know what's going to come up, and you want to have just a bit of cash in case. And that bit is called precautionary demand. Now, the last bit is that you think your money is more valuable than bonds. You think the interest rate's going to change in your favor later. You think that maybe the value of bonds is going to decrease in the future. So you're speculating that, and that's what we call speculative demand. So this says that you suggest that the investors should now hold cash instead of stocks or bonds. So that's an example of speculative demand. Next one. The economy begins at equilibrium E0. Now consider an expansion of the money supply. What is the long-run effect of this change? So this is a big concept here, but it's talking about the neutrality of money. So before we talk about that, this is our money demand model. So it graphs interest rate on the y-axis and the quantity of money on the x-axis. So we have 2 things here. We have money supply. Get my textbook out of the way there. Money supply, which is completely vertical. The amount of money in the economy at a given time is fixed. And then we have a demand for money, which is a downward sloping curve. And right here is our monetary equilibrium. So this says increase or decrease. An expansion of the money supply. Let's consider an increase in the money supply. What is that going to do? Well, an increase in the money supply, can I make that red? Pink, perfect. What's that going to do? We're going to move down this curve to a new monetary equilibrium. So this is our old equilibrium interest rate, and here is our new equilibrium interest rate. Our equilibrium interest rate went down. What does that mean? What does it mean when our equilibrium interest rate goes down? Now, if you recall, when our interest rate, let me switch to black, goes down, that makes our investment go up. So, so in the short run, what's going to happen? Our investment's going to go up. That means that our AE is going to go up. And what happens when our AE goes up? Well, our AD goes to the right. So if we graph that now, if our AD goes to the right, so here is our AS model, AS. Well, when we have an increase in investment, our AD curve, sorry, did I say shift? Yeah, shifts to the right. Right? Because we have an increase in aggregate expenditure, so we have an increase in aggregate demand. So this is our short-run equilibrium. Remember that this is price level and GDP, and this is potential GDP. So after that, what happens? Well, if we recall, because there was no government intervention, in the long run, what's going to happen is our aggregate supply is going to shift to the left. Our aggregate supply is going to shift this way. This is AS2. Here's AD2. So this is short run, and then we get to the long run. We move back here. So notice that we actually, our AD curve has shifted out to E1, but in the long run, we go back to E2. So what that's saying, this concept of the neutrality of money, is saying that even if we change the money supply, we're just going to end up back at the same real GDP, right? GDP adjusted for inflation. We're going to end up at the same real GDP with a higher price level. And if you think about that, that's kind of what the concept of inflation is, right? Because inflation means that we're adding more money into the economy. And as a result, our currency is worth less. And now everything has to cost more. Everything costs more because we have more currency to buy things with. So that's what happens, right? Our real GDP stays the same. Our actual wealth doesn't go up if everybody gets $5, if everyone becomes $5 richer, really no one is that much richer because prices will just go up and everything will adjust. So that's talking about the neutrality of money, which is a concept. So this next one, starting at equilibrium E0, an increase in the money supply will result in. So exact same graph. Let's look at an increase in the money supply. Well, our interest rate is going to go down, right? Our MS curve is going to shift to the right. That would be an increase because this graph is just the quantity of money. So if the quantity of money goes up, we're going to the right. And the interest rate goes down, following the interest rate. This next question is the proposition of long-run neutrality of money is supported by evidence of over than 50 years and many countries that there is a positive relationship between. What is the positive relationship between? Inflation rates and money supply growth. When the money supply grows, our inflation rate goes up, right? We just talked about that. The real GDP doesn't change, but our inflation would go up. We have more inflation. Consider the supply and demand of money. When there is an excess supply of money, monetary equilibrium is restored through. Okay, excess supply of money. So let's graph that out real quick. I don't want to use, let's use black. So here's our money demand. And an excess supply of money just looks like this. It means we're at equilibrium over here. This is interest rate, and this is quantity money. Remember that this is money supply. So what happens when our interest rate is too high? When our interest rate is too high. So what we're going to see now is that there is more money, there's a greater money supply than there is money demanded here, right? There is an excess here. There's more money in the economy than we need for our everyday things. So what's going to happen? Well, we don't need all this money. We're going to loan it out to people. And what we mean by loaning out is we're going to buy a bond. A bond represents debt. So if I'm loaning you $10, you could buy a $10 bond off me. Those things, they mean the same thing. So I'm going to buy bonds. What does that mean? Well, now everyone wants to buy bonds because they have too much money. So there's an increase of demand for bonds. What does that mean? So let's look at a very simple just demand and supply model, right? Demand and supply. Well, now if there's an increase in demand, then there is an increase in the price. There's an increase in the price of bonds. So that's the whole question. What's going to happen when the price of bonds increase? So the price of bonds, and interest rate are negatively related. When the price of when one goes up, the other goes down. So when the price of bonds are rising, that means the interest rate is going to fall. So our interest rate is going to fall back down here, And we're going to get back to monetary equilibrium at I star. Just like that. That's how you answer that question. Now, consider the monetary transmission mechanism. The monetary transmission mechanism is pretty much what we just talked about. That's buying and selling bonds to change the interest rate to get us back to equilibrium. So a decrease in the money supply. A decrease. So here we'll graph that again. These questions, they don't take a long time to graph, so it's a good idea to graph them. For sure. This is our old I star. And I mean, I'm drawing them pretty quickly, right? So it's not a big deal. MS, money supply, Q, money. Now we have a decrease in the money supply over here. What happens? Well, we move along this money demand curve, right? This is MD. And we get a higher interest rate. A higher interest rate. This is MS2. So we raise the interest rates. Remember what happens when we raise interest rates? That means investment falls because the two are negatively related. So we lower investment. And investment and aggregate expenditure are positively related. So that would be a decrease in aggregate expenditure as well. And what would that mean for AD? Well, that would mean that AD would shift to the left. To the left. And in the long run, of course, that would mean that aggregate supply would shift again to adjust for that. But that's a long run concept. This is short run. The linkage between changes in monetary equilibrium and changes in aggregate demand is called the monetary transmission mechanism. That's just what it's called. It's none of these other things. Equilibrium mechanism is not a real thing. Liquidity preference function, we have never talked about. Your liquidity preference refers to your propensity to have money in cash as opposed to loans. Your simple multiplier, nope, definitely not. And transactions mechanism is not a thing either. Okay, consider the monetary transmission mechanism in an open economy. All other things being equal, an increase in the money supply. Okay, so I kind of talked about this already, talking about inflation. What's going to happen? If there's an increase in the money supply, that's going to decrease. It's not going to decrease, it's going to depreciate our currency. Our currency that we held before is worth less, right? If you only held $5 and then you gave everyone $10, that $5 that you held is worth a lot less now because now you have 15 as like your whole wealth, right? What does that mean though? If your currency is worth less, you're going to stimulate net exports, because now it's cheaper to buy from your country. And when you raise your net exports, you raise aggregate expenditure, right? And when you raise aggregate expenditure, you raise or shift to the right aggregate demand. Shift to the right. The opportunity cost of holding money rather than bonds. Bonds are loans. You earn interest on your loans. So the opportunity cost is the rate of interest that you would have earned on bonds. And the last one, with reference to the Canadian economy, there are structural changes that make it harder to grow fast without stoking rapid inflation. The growing number of old people is probably the most important shift because the population of people in their prime working years is shrinking. This is literally just talking about the change in the participation rate of the labor force, right? It has nothing to do with inflation rate at all, so we get that out. A decrease in the level of potential output. That's interesting, right? Because I thought about that one too. So it's definitely not a decline in the total population, and it's usually not none of the above. So it's between B and C. So let's think about that. The growing number of old people is probably the most important shift. So that's saying that there are more old people. Is that going to change the level of potential output? Not necessarily. Not necessarily. We don't know who's replacing them, right? We don't know how their output is going to change. What we do know is that because the population of people in their prime working years is shrinking, we do know that there's a change in the participation rate, because right? We had the baby boom. We had all of those old people working. Now there's less of them working because we just have less people to work. That's it for part 1.